You are listening to Influencers from the Conference Board. What are the sustainability and social impact priorities of global C-suite executives? And how is one of the world's largest consumer goods companies, Kimberly-Clark, addressing the evolving consumer demand for more sustainable products and services? Based on recent findings from the Conference Board's research, as well as insights on Kimberly-Clark's sustainability initiatives, join Chuck Mitchell, Executive Director, Knowledge Content and Quality at the Conference Board, and Lisa Morden, Vice President, Safety and Sustainability at Kimberly-Clark Corporation, for a look at the challenges ahead in sustainability and social impact. This month's chat was moderated by Denise Dahlhoff, Senior Researcher, Consumer Research at the Conference Board. We present that conversation now.
Hello and welcome to our June chat by the Marketing and Communications Center here at the Conference Board. I'm Denise Dahlhoff, Senior Researcher here at the Conference Board focused on consumer research, and I will be moderating the chat today. Our topic today is sustainability from a marketing perspective, and we will be hearing from one of our member companies, Kimberly-Clark, what they are actually doing on sustainability and their perspectives on this. Sustainability actually has come a long, long way since the radical idea about a couple of decades ago about the triple bottom line, which was the idea to not just look at the financial results of companies, but also look at what companies are doing socially, their social impact, and what they do to protect the environment. And today it's a difficult field to navigate because there are so many stakeholders and objectives for companies to keep in mind. It's not just the financial goals and shareholders, but also, the broader public, often represented also by the government and by regulations and policies and laws, but also thinking of customers, employees, as well as management itself. Managers have ideas of what is the right thing to do. So, there are many, many questions. It's a very hot topic, and we're really thrilled to talk about this topic today. And thanks again for joining us. Let me introduce our speakers for today's chat because they are true experts on our topic. First, joining us is Lisa Morden, Vice President for Safety and Sustainability at Kimberly-Clark. Lisa is joining us remotely from the Kimberly-Clark offices. Lisa has been a member of the Conference Board for several years. She is actually very actively involved. Thank you so much for engagement, Lisa, and thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks, Denise.
And then here at the Conference Board offices, I'm joined by my colleague, Chuck Mitchell. He's the Executive Director of Knowledge, Content, and Quality at the Conference Board. Chuck has been here for a long, long time. He has been involved in so much research across all of our centers, including on sustainability. And he will actually kick it off in a minute with research that he has been doing with CEOs and C-suites across the world. And so with that, we can get started. As I mentioned, the Conference Board actually has a lot of initiatives going on sustainability across all our centers, from human capital to we have now an ESG center. In marketing and communications, we have done research on sustainability. And Chuck specifically has been involved in this annual C-suite survey around the world. Actually, he has been a key member of the team for many, many years. And he will kick off the conversation by sharing the latest results on sustainability from the 2019 study.
Right.
So,
thanks, Denise.
Thanks for joining.
Yeah, to get this started, just a few data points that we're going to look at from our annual C-Suite Challenge CEO survey around sustainability and how CEOs see dealing with the future customer 2025 and beyond. So for this sustainability notion, we asked CEOs what they thought a sustainable organization or the key traits of a sustainable organization would be by 2025, what's going to be success in that area? And it was really interesting in that, it's a little non-traditional view of sustainability, if you will. They're looking at the long-term viability of their businesses, and they see sustainability certainly as a value driver for growth. But it's also really about people. It's about the people within their organizations, and it's also about the customers that they're going to deal with. When their view, a sustainable organization has to have and be committed to its employees and to its customers. So you'll see that notion of a high-quality employee experience and leveraging sustainability for talent strategies too very high. Then it certainly comes on the list this notion of sustainability steering product portfolio. That's the part of the value driver for growth too, right? So they're looking to see that that are anticipating future demand for products that are as sustainable. So this kind of surprised us a little bit in that they went away from that view of traditional resource use or perhaps or UN and ESG goals, and more towards the people within their organization. So that surprised us a little bit. And of course, there's going to be a premium within the organization for value creation. They see in the future very, very much walking the talk, if you will, by aligning compensation to value creation rather than short-term stock performance. So that's, I think, an encouraging sign. When we asked about dealing with the customers of the future, again, to set the baseline, it's about quality, and that's always an evergreen in this survey, and it has been for the 20 years that we've done it. The other part that I think is interesting is this notion of customers becoming more value conscious. And that also ties into those two areas in the red box related specifically to sustainability. And that notion that customers, they expect more, or 50% of CEOs in our responding pool, I expect, and this is a global response pool, I expect customers to be factoring in a company's values and their citizenship into purchasing decisions. And they also, a very sizable minority, just under 50%, believe that customers will be willing to pay a premium for sustainably produced products. So there you see that customer of the future, they're going to be value conscious, and they're going to value that relationship with the organizations that they purchase from. It's not just about product, it's that relationship that they form with those companies around those companies' values and citizenship performance.
Well, that's a lot of content on sustainability from actually various angles. And what is really interesting that you highlighted on the first slide, going back there, that about half of the C-suite sees sustainability as a value driver, which again goes back a little bit to this financial goal idea. And, I would love for Lisa to share with us how this sounds from the perspective of Kimberly-Clark. Like, do you think about sustainability initiatives from a growth driver perspective? And, growth always screams for, you want to measure it. Is there any way any metrics that you use for that?
Sure. That's a great question, Denise. And, I think that the data does actually make sense. And I think we are seeing some evolution in mindsets and how we think about sustainability from a business perspective, which is really fantastic to hear, I think. At KC, we always talk about sustainability as being about living our values, but it's about creating value as well. So whether you consider sustainability to be about mitigating risk and future-proofing your business, ergo removing potential barriers to growth, or as an opportunity to connect with your consumers, your customers, your employees, or even investors increasingly, the potential to create more value is certainly there in our view. I find it interesting how millennials and Gen Z, their expectations about the brands and the companies they affiliate with are increasing. They're looking for brands and organizations that have that make a positive social contribution or environmental contribution, and are increasingly dissociating themselves with those that do not. So if you think about the future and how you grow your business into the future, I think it's really smart for our C-suite executives and our CEOs to be thinking about the role that they play and how to connect with consumers in that space in a different way that very much involves sustainability and social responsibility.
Super.
Yeah, Lisa, I think that's a good point, and it's not only the millennials and generations that are following as customers, but it's also about employees. And our research on the human capital side certainly finds that the choice employer, and especially in a tight labor market, it has to do around the mission of the company itself, right? So, and that's that notion of talent retention and talent acquisition strategy. So it's a different world than it was 10 years ago.
Indeed. Sorry, Denise.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to add that, at Kimberly-Clark, our vision is to lead the world in essentials for a better life. It's a pretty inspirational mission or vision for the organization. It drives innovation. It drives how we attract and retain talent. It really is about who we are as an organization. And I think that's critically important for existing employees and future employees as you try to attract talent into the future.
Yeah, I would imagine, to my question about, tracking the impact, that must be really, really hard. In marketing, we talk a lot about attribution, what kinds of activities, cause certain outcomes. I would imagine that's even harder here, right? In, sustainability initiatives to measure the impact.
Yes, it surely is. I think part of the challenge is that I know our team has really worked hard to overcome is really around how you measure the value creation that can sometimes be somewhat intangible. How well you resonate and the work that you're doing inspires employees and future employees, for example, is difficult to put a number to. But, what we try to do here is really focus on sustainability matters that are absolutely relevant to our business, those that we feel like we have the biggest opportunities to create both business value and social or environmental value as well, and social environmental impact. Don't try to solve all things for all people everywhere, but we really focus on those items where we feel like we can make a significant difference. And as a result of that focus, we're able to apply some of our traditional business metrics, things like top line growth, brand equity improvement, measures that are really about how we're positioning our products and our brands externally, while at the same time looking at how does it help improve the lives of people in need, how does it reduce our climate impacts, et cetera. So we try and measure both sides of that equation to ensure that we're focusing on the right priorities as the organization. But it is challenging, no question.
Yeah. Chuck, have you heard anything? I know you have worked with so many companies and come across so many. Have you heard anything about, business impact and what companies are doing and how they're thinking about that in the context of sustainability? Yeah,
I mean, absolutely. And I think that, Lisa, you were getting at that notion of the shared value creation that a lot of organizations, with the two that come to mind, or one that certainly comes to mind is when I think of how Pepsi works with its water initiatives. They have a heat map that looks at their bottling plants that are under threat from water resources locally. This is globally around the world. And then they'll go into those areas and work with the communities to start to look at water resource use, water resource preservation. And, that's helping those communities itself. I mean, I'm thinking of how helping rice farmers grow with low water volume rice. And also ensuring that for Pepsi that there's a sustainable plant there for the next 50 years and beyond. So, yeah, the notion of shared value, as you said, creating value, and not only for the company and for shareholders and stakeholders, but for the community and society overall as well. So it's a win. The cliche, but it's a win-win.
Thanks so much. Actually, we just got an audience question, which is actually to Chuck about the research. Do you have any split in terms of from what kinds of industries companies responded on the sustainability drivers? Is there any correlation between what bubbles to the top and what's more to the bottom? Yeah,
I can certainly on a geographic split that sustainability is a growth driver. What you see on there now is a global result, but when we do the geographic breaks, it was pretty much in that same position across the board. So it's a global thought on this. When we looked at industry breaks, we have a survey response of about 1,500 globally. When we do the industry breaks, they're broad. This manufacturing, financial services, and services. And my recollection is that we saw it fairly uniform across all, but maybe a slight uptick in the notion of sustainability on the manufacturing side as a growth driver. It was maybe a little bit higher than services side.
Interesting. So let me tag on what you said earlier, Lisa, about, and you mentioned innovation, as part of sustainability. I came across a really interesting quote by the CEO of Kering, the European luxury company, François-Henri Pinault, who said, I'm just paraphrasing, but he said, sustainability is a business opportunity. It makes you more innovative as it forces you to question your old habits and rethink the way you do business, and then it creates new opportunities for you. And so I'd be really curious to hear from you, Lisa, how innovation plays into that at Kimberly-Clark, especially from a product portfolio perspective. Like, how does that inform your new product development?
Yeah, great question. If we think about the kind of brands that Kimberly-Clark manufactures and sells into the markets that we have, Huggies, Kotex, Depend, Kleenex, et cetera, all of these are actually designed to actually contribute to positive social outcomes, enabling active aging, helping children and babies to thrive, empowering women. All of these brands really come with some of those embedded inherent social values, no question. And that has always been the core of who we are as a company and what we try to deliver from an innovation perspective. But if we think about that vision that I talked about, delivering essentials for a better life, and leading the world in that, there's a broader context that's implied there as well. So we need to, through that lens, also take into account the communities where we live and work, the markets that we serve, and understand the implications of our entire supply chain from source to shelf and even beyond the shelf at this point in time. And some of the challenges that emerge from that look really give us some interesting opportunities for innovation. And we're beginning to pull that into our thinking much more actively today than we ever have before. I think one of the most significant examples that we're talking about a lot internally right now relates to what I call the problem with plastics. As we've all seen in the news, a lot of, pretty grim pictures and images related to wildlife being entangled in plastic and consuming plastic, et cetera. So the fact that we have so much of this material at its end of life that's accumulating in the environment sort of says to us, is there an opportunity to drive some innovation that begins to mitigate that challenge and that problem? The innovation comes in product and materials potentially, but it also comes in the form of systems and solutions externally to help with waste management development and infrastructure development in places where you really want to grow your business. So within that one challenge area, we see a ton of innovation opportunity that actually is taking on a much more urgent and critical need going forward.
And that's so awesome to hear. It seems like especially the plastic initiatives and the movement across the world right now is truly global. There are so many brands now behind that, and it's awesome to see both from as you mentioned, supply chain ingredient perspective, but also thinking about how can you reuse plastic. And, I know Adidas, for example, they make new shoes, or plastic is used for these, what do you call, like the track and field,
yes.
And all kinds of other products, which is great. But question for you, Chuck, have you come across any, how sustainability thinking and philosophy has influenced innovation and product development?
Yeah, certainly so. Going back to our C-Suite Challenge survey, one of the biggest barriers to innovation that CEOs see in 2025 and beyond is the notion of regulation, right? And traditionally, the notion of regulation can be seen as an obstacle, or it can be seen as a potential source of innovation, right? And that necessity is that mother of innovation, if you will, right? And when you look at it in that notion of regulation to innovation, and regulation vis-a-vis the environment, which is also when we ask CEOs what areas do they see regulation intensifying in the coming years, food safety and environment protection was the key, along with social media. So so it's in some ways too that regulation forces innovation, and it depends on the view and maybe the corporate culture from within as to seeing it as an opportunity or seeing it as a potential obstacle. So at least just one question that I had when you're talking about supply chain, has embedding that notion of sustainability within the supply chain started to change the relationship between Kimberly-Clark and its vendors? What kind of impact is that having? I'm curious.
Yeah, that's a great question, Chuck, and absolutely. I think sustainability in KC actually has its roots in supply chain, is what I would say. As a company that has had a pretty large manufacturing footprint around the world, we've always had this eco-awareness and eco-consciousness and eco-efficiency mindset across the value chain and the supply chain. And one of the examples that I always like to point to that is probably our most advanced example that provides a good internal how to do it case study relates to fiber sourcing. We're one of the largest pulp buyers in the world. So we partner with a lot of suppliers in different regions and different ecosystems, if you will, to source wood pulp to support manufacturing of our personal care products. And many years ago, we started a process with our suppliers that was really focused on ensuring that we had strong forest management practices in place that were not contributing to deforestation and hopefully not creating forest degradation issues. Certainly as a business resiliency question, as a supply chain resiliency question, that's critically important for us. It's not dissimilar to your example about PepsiCo and water. Our water is certainly fiber and pulp in that translation. So working with the supply chain very intentionally and setting some clear procurement policies, expectations, and practices that we drive back through our supply chain has been a huge priority for us, and something that has really caused things like FSC certification with our supply chain to grow immensely over the last decade.
Sounds like there's a lot of collaboration also going on. I imagine that must be very, interactive and collaborative.
Absolutely has to be. There are on forest management and forest sustainability, there are many stakeholders that are highly interested in that conversation, not just for biodiversity protection, but also as it relates to climate. So we have to partner with our suppliers. We have to partner with the NGO community. We have to partner with certifiers and ensure that we're really continuing to move the ball down the field and, protect high conservation values and things like critical habitat for caribou in Canada, for example. Very important for us going forward.
Yeah. And let me just take a second to remind our audience again, we would love your participation. So please, don't be shy to put in questions in the box, in the space on the right-hand side of your screen. And just to switch gears a little bit, Lisa, you mentioned already, your initiatives are way broader than just the customer. However, you touch many other audiences. However, the customer, of course, is an important stakeholder in companies. And to that end, actually, we recently conducted a global research project in 64 countries surveying consumers on their views and behaviors regarding sustainability. And I just wanted to really quickly share some of the findings. One of the questions was, what do you even associate with sustainability? Because the term is used, of course, in corporations by professionals, but it is also used for a very broad range of activities, as has become clear from this conversation. And so it was really interesting for us to see. We gave options that ranged from, we gave like a list of options in terms of associations. Do you think about it as, the environment or recycling, air pollution, or is it things like fair labor, fair wages? And so what we found was really interesting. Like the associations vary by region and often by country, but they're fairly stable within regions. And we found that in North America and Asia Pacific, an ecological understanding of sustainability dominates, meaning like people associated with recycling, the environment, air pollution, and things like that. Whereas in Europe and the Middle East and Africa, it had a way more social understanding, meaning fair wages, fair labor conditions. And in Latin America, it was almost balanced. And, we thought that was really interesting because it was a quite clear result. But the question is this because these values are more prominent or more important, more dominant in these regions? Or is that an outcome of companies' activities and also their communication to consumers? So I'd be really interested in hearing from Lisa, because you as a global company must be facing this all the time. What do you think about these results? And, how does Kimberly-Clark communicate to consumers?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So the results that on this chart was actually really quite interesting to see these results, Denise, because we absolutely see the same thing as it relates to our business. We operate in every region that you've got illustrated here, and we have certainly seen this diversity firsthand and experienced it firsthand. And the observation that I think I've had over the years is that yes, we certainly see in parts of the world sort of the social aspects or the social dimensions of sustainability outweighing the eco dimensions, et cetera, and vice versa. And I do believe it's part of, I think it is part cultural, but I also believe that it's also part how we communicate and talk to those regions and within those regions. It's what they culturally value, and it's what they've heard about for many generations, I think. So I think even as a practical matter, when we think about some of this diversity, going back to the waste example I was mentioning earlier, you've got infrastructure systems, waste infrastructure systems in different parts of the world that have evolved very, very differently through time. And therefore, the consumer sees that, and they're trained or they're taught to use certain behaviors to recycle or not recycle, separate your cans, put your plastics in a different place, et cetera. So how they've experienced, quotes unquote, social and ecological or environmental dimensions really does form their opinion about what sustainability means. So that diversity is certainly pervasive, and it is a challenge. But, I think it shows that there really isn't just one single answer or approach for a global company like KC. And we have to be flexible and pragmatic to determine which sustainability-related issues are relevant to the company, because the relevance is absolutely related to what's locally important from a practical matter and what's regionally relevant from a consumer perspective. We have to have a broad enough framework that we can be flexible within it to accommodate some of those nuances and tendencies while still working on the most significant and relevant and material issues for the company overall.
Mm-hmm. I imagine, it makes it way more complex. You have to be so much more differentiated and obviously knowing your individual markets, but, it might also be the fun of it.
It is, absolutely. I would say too, right, that the companies like Kimberly-Clark, we have at least a very regional and local empowerment model, where our marketing and innovation teams are out in the regions, out in the various countries that we're growing our business in, and they're really there to help understand those local and regional nuances. So our sustainability strategies and our sustainability communication strategies are actually strategic frameworks, and they allow a lot of flexibility within them for local customization. That being said, we do want to be sure as a company that our narrative around sustainability isn't wildly inconsistent around the world. So these frameworks allow us to prioritize and help focus our work, while at the same time not looking like we're completely different companies and different organizations.
Yeah, it's like the glocalization, right? Being global yet localized, within limits. Chuck, wondering what you thought about these results, and also what might you have worked so much with executives? What might their views be on, what do they associate mostly with sustainability?
I think to Lisa's point that it's so much of it comes down to the microeconomic and the social, the local social conditions, right? So, when I look at that chart that was up there, this notion of it makes sense that the eco part in North America, there's so much media attention to that. And Asia Pacific, when I think of the case of China, where they're living with polluted cities on a day-to-day basis, that focus would be on the eco side. Where in Europe, the amount of regulation, the product life cycle, those sorts of things are pretty well established. So you can start to look at a different set of notions, and that's the idea around the social that I get. So, I think Middle East, Africa. It's social issues predominate, and it just kind of makes sense. So I think from that notion, right, it's those issues remain on a local or regional basis, and as Lisa said, that's the way I think any organization needs to address it. You have the global framework, and then you start to regionalize the issues that have impact, right? So, and that's really what we see.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, though, with having so many different, activities under one umbrella term, and actually the Sustainable Development Goals by the UN are even broader than in our survey. There is something like zero hunger and no poverty and education and gender equality, all kinds of social subjects, under this umbrella. I just wonder, is it time to differentiate more, to use different labels other than just sustainability? Would that make sense? Question to both of you. Chuck, do you have any? Lisa, any thoughts on that?
It's a really interesting question, Denise, and I'll have to tell you that from my role in the company, I've actually challenged that question myself several times, because I do think the definition of sustainability is somewhat in the eye of the beholder, and there are assumptions and presumptions that get made. So if you really want to be clear on expectations and the carve out the piece of work, i.e. your own individual company-wide definition of sustainability, you may actually need to be a little bit more specific in what it means. The way that we've tackled it is by having a large sustainability strategy that we call Sustainability 2022. But within that strategy, there are 5 pillars of focus that we are really defining as what's important for KC within that. So when we talk about sustainability, it's typically referencing one of those 5 planks or pillars of focus. That's how we've tackled the challenge, but it is one that we continue to query internally. There's no question.
Mm-hmm. Chuck, any thoughts on on the labeling and differentiating more, to be more specific what companies mean when they talk about our sustainability initiatives?
I think certainly within the organization there has to be a clear focus and a clear strategy that's articulated throughout the organization to get that alignment. Maybe this is an extension of that question, but I know one of the things that we see through our consumer research is a lot of confusion around external labeling for products, for services. What is a sustainable product? What is what is organic? Those sorts of things, and so there's a lot of confusion on the consumer side, and there's not a huge amount of trust either on that notion. So. I think some of it comes down to, as Lisa was talking about, communication externally out to the customers, right? But those are some of the issues that start to surface, and when you think of if you're asking for a premium price to be paid for a sustainably produced product, the consumer that buys that needs to trust, right? That origin needs to trust that, and that's back to the relationship with that company. So those are a little different thoughts. I'm taking in a little different direction.
Yeah, no, that's fine. By the way, we just got an audience question, and that's for you, Lisa. The question is, how much is And in what way is the board of Kimberly-Clark involved in your sustainability, thinking and work?
Yeah, we've got some really great strategic thinkers on our board, and we meet with them at least once a year to talk a little bit about our goals, our progress, some of the areas that we're finding to be more challenging than others, and they give us some really great feedback and insights. So they do help to shape our work and our actions going forward. I would also say, in addition to that, investors are increasingly interested, and we're certainly very active in the ESG space. Our investor relations teams and our team that works very, very directly with the board on a routine basis are increasingly having conversations around how our ESG performance is looking. So they're pretty active, no question. I would also add that we have an external sustainability advisory board that we meet with a couple of times a year to really review our progress. They help us to see areas that might be, blind spots for us, or areas that we need to increase our activity or our efforts around. And that really does help to shape our thinking and our direction as well. So between the board of directors and the sustainability advisory board, we've got some really good feedback.
Mm-hmm. Please, just a question. So who makes up the external advisory board?
Yeah. Sorry, Chuck, go ahead.
No, just what's the makeup of that external advisory board? I think that's interesting.
Yeah, we've had the board in place for more than a decade now, I believe, and we rotate external thought leaders through depending on capability needs that we have. Certain areas that we want to focus on as we go forward. So we've typically have between 3 and 8 different people on the board at any one time. And we'll recruit in folks for a couple of year stint with us, a term of 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, depending on whether we're still, working together in a way that helps us to move forward. So it's been a very, very strong help as we've, accelerated our sustainability program in KC over the last 10 to 15 years.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I want to go back to the results, that some of the results that Chuck mentioned earlier, and that some things that you have mentioned about customers, which is the survey found that executives think that corporate citizenship and values will play a much bigger role for customers, and that they are also willing to pay more. And Lisa, you also already mentioned that especially younger generations are really into buying sustainable products. They really ask for it. But just curious to hear from you, often consumers report that they're willing to pay more for sustainable products, but ultimately when it comes to truly buying it and paying much more, they don't do it. What is your experience on that in terms of willingness to pay?
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult, it's very difficult research to see play out in reality. I would say, consumer marketing in the sustainability space or the green space or even the social CSR space is a really difficult thing because behaviors don't always follow stated attitudes from a research perspective. There's no question. But I do think that consumers generally want to make the best choice possible for themselves. And Chuck touched on this earlier. I think consumers will look for price and quality and performance, and that's critically important for them. But when all of those kinds of factors are taken equal, sustainability or eco-friendliness or CSR could actually be a differentiator and a tiebreaker. So to us, I think that's very important. That's a strong tendency that we think, and a strong trend that will continue to grow. So, consumers are expecting their premium brands, their trusted premium brands, to be safe and healthy for them, but also safe and healthy for the planet. That said, even those value buyers, when it relates to a lot of our categories, we try and drive many of our programs across several categories, not just an individual brand or secondary brand. So things like Forest Stewardship Council certification, that really cuts across many of our tissue-based product categories. So even as a value buyer, you can have some assurance that the products that you're getting are responsibly sourced and responsibly manufactured.
Mm-hmm. And that's great. You mentioned product quality is super important, and price, that's another important criteria. And we saw that in that global survey that I mentioned as well. So we saw that, we asked for barriers to buy sustainable products. And one of the reasons, especially in Asia Pacific, was that the quality wasn't, living up to their expectations. And of course, if you think of, you wouldn't buy like a T-shirt that doesn't fit well or that's scratchy. Of course, you would expect, the quality to be as good as, alternatives that are not as sustainable. But an interesting question is also to think of consumers and B2B customers in terms of willingness to pay. And question for, for Chuck is, do you think that differs between B2C and B2B companies?
I think in that, and it goes back to that whole sourcing and value chain issue, right? And if an organization is committed to developing that sustainable a portfolio of sustainable products, then managing costs within that, and I think in a lot of cases when you start to get into supply chains and you're looking for sources that are sustainably friendly, that cuts down your pool of potential source vendors, right? In a sense, so you start to look at the potential for premium, which has to then be reflected in the consumer, the consumer price. But I think that probably the two worlds are some way really being parallel in that, if consumers are driving this notion for sustainable, there's a greater demand for sustainable products on the B2C side. So in order for the organization to be able to produce those, then they, in a sense, are driving the demand down through the supply chain. And I think one of the important things is, and that goes back to a company culture and its company ethics, as to how far down into the supply chain one starts to look. And one of the issues in my time in Asia that came up frequently with some multinationals was that on the chief legal side, on the legal side of it, the legal side was looking for basically a checkbox, check the box that certifies suppliers. Those on the ethics and sustainability side were looking to get into those second, third tier suppliers and do the certification. So even within the company itself, you had a conflict of interest, if you will, on how you go about ensuring that the program is, and the suppliers and vendors are giving you what you're expecting to get on this from a sustainable origin. So, that's an issue that is still, we still hear from a lot of organizations. It creates a conflict within an organization.
Yeah, that's interesting. Another really hot topic or question for companies, in the sustainability world is always, should companies take a public stance on issues? And Chuck shared earlier on the slides that 13% of executives worldwide think that companies should take a stance publicly on issues. That's, you might say that's a low number. We have seen in other studies with employees, for example, or customers that number might be much higher. But it would be really great to hear from you, Lisa, how Kimberly-Clark thinks about this and whether you have taken a public stance on things or deliberately not taken a stance on issues.
Yeah, I would say a case here, KC, and I think this applies to companies in general. We can't take a political stand on every single issue. But when you think about your company's values, putting your values first and ensuring that when you do take a stand, it's because you feel like your company's or organizational values are somehow at risk or being threatened. I think that's really when companies have very good reason to stand up and use their voice more publicly. A good example for us was a couple of years ago with the recent legislation that several states proposed regarding gender-specific bathrooms. These bathroom bills conflicted with our values as it related to diversity and inclusion. So that was one time when Kimberly-Clark decided to take a stand on an issue, and come out against some of this legislation. That being said, I think you also want to have credibility related to a topic that you take a stand on. And very often for us, that actually takes the form of not political advocacy, but it takes the form of brand relevance. So a program that we're very proud of here at Kimberly-Clark, we call Toilets Change Lives. And you'll see that on some of our bath tissue brands around the world, a logo that says Toilets Change Lives. And that, as one of the biggest bath tissue producers in the world and marketers in the world, the issue of lack of access to sanitation for consumers and future consumers and even people that aren't consumers is a very, very big problem. 1 in 3 people around the world don't have access. So this is an area where our brand actually plays a role in helping to tackle some of those very significant social issues around the world. And it's something that causes our teams to rally as well internally to support those causes. It's certainly relevant to the brand. It's relevant to who we are as a company, and it certainly helps us to live our values. So that's an example, I think, of where it makes a lot of sense for companies to engage.
So it's definitely more related to what's relevant to the brand.
Yeah, I think this question that's come up just exactly about that, and this notion of how at KC, how do you actually measure the impact on the human capital outcomes? You're talking about creating a sense of mission within those business units, if you will, or product lines that are sustainability related. And then the question is around, are you measuring the human capital outcomes around, say, retention and cost to replace, employee satisfaction, employee engagement? And obviously you can link those to financial benefits if they're having an impact. But are you measuring that in a sense?
I would say, in a sense, yes, Chuck. We're certainly attempting, and these metrics these measurements are very difficult to collect and to gather. So we certainly have our internal employee engagement surveys that I think many of these social and sustainability programs help to contribute to in terms of overall employee engagements and employee enablement. And we feel like it's an important driver, an important pillar and plank of that. So we do monitor and measure that routinely. As it relates to some of those external human capital outcomes, we attempt to measure things like how many people in need have we positively impacted and benefited through time. Is when we think about some of those social impact programs that are brand led, it's very much about how many lives are we improving. The calculation there, we typically sit around the table and actually ask ourselves some very, very tough questions around to be sure that we're not over indexing on truly what it means to help people and to help them evolve from poverty. The other area I think that we measure a little bit more tangibly, you sort of touched on it earlier, is in the area of social compliance, human rights within our supply chain, and working with our suppliers, tier 1, tier 2 suppliers, where we feel like there is the potential for more risk from a human rights or a social compliance perspective. We have very structured formal programming there that helps us to see where risks are occurring or where performance opportunities for improvement exist. And we have very tangible measurements around how we're helping in that regard and some of the human capital benefits that come from that. But it is very, very difficult space.
Actually, related to that, I recently heard a CMO say that these are unprecedented times and that employees are actually expecting for their employer to speak up about things. And that's also consistent with, there was a study, the Trust Barometer by Edelman this year showed that employees or people in general trust their employer the most, like more than the media and all kinds of other organizations. And so question for you, like, have you seen this advocacy for certain values? You mentioned, your campaign for bathrooms, for example, but have you seen that from employees come as well? that they want the company to speak up about certain things?
I would say, in the bathroom legislation, we have employee networks here at Kimberly-Clark, and we have a Pride committee. And certainly, as you think about the role that they play in our organization, we wanted to be sure that they were recognizing and seeing that KC was willing to take a position on some of these issues that were directly related to our values. Beyond that, I would tell you that from my seat, I see many more employees stepping into the conversation around sustainability in general. There are specific topics that I feel like are coming up more and more frequently. And certainly as it relates to our categories, this issue around plastics and single-use disposable plastics is so significant. That is a topic that I see a lot of employees expressing a lot of concern and a lot of inquiry about what the company is doing to progressively begin to tackle this particular challenge. So I do think we see more employee advocacy going into the future. And certainly as eco-awareness and social consciousness continues to emerge in people's attitudes and perspectives on the world, I think we'll continue to see more of that.
Mm-hmm. We just got another audience question in, which is about another stakeholder group, shareholders and investors, what they expect companies to report in terms of ESG information. Of course, there are also, now all kinds of funds that invest into certain companies that have great ESG standards. But Chuck, do you have any thoughts on that, on what shareholders are expecting from companies in terms of reporting and metrics? And also,
I mean, certainly the trend, and it's an emerging trend. Let's say it's not an overwhelming majority, but the notion of integrated reporting is becoming more important. One of the issues that finding with putting value against that type of reporting is there certainly are some standardizations of measurement out there, but not everyone adheres to it. And that sometimes that integrated reporting, or at least putting value on social impact, is a little bit all over the place. But the trend, there certainly is a greater demand for stakeholders, shareholders, institutional investors to look more at the long-term sustainability of a company, and that includes ESG measures, but it also includes things like human capital risk. So that's yes, the demands are becoming more complex, and the expectations are increasing. That you get a lot of mandates and directives in Europe. I'm thinking about things like pay gaps. And female employment numbers vis-a-vis are mandated in several European countries. So, the awareness is there, and I think that's the pressure. The pressure will probably increase for certainly more integrated reporting, looking not only both at the eco side and the social side. Absolutely.
How about from your perspective, Lisa, at Kimberly-Clark? What's your experience?
Yeah, I think Chuck summarized it quite well. It's there's a trend there in terms of investor interest and engagement in sustainability and how they evaluate the performance by various companies on an ESG basis. Certainly, there are more ESG surveys and rankings and ratings processes than we certainly have ever seen in the past. And all of these different ratings have different priorities and different criteria. At KC, we still continue to report and put our disclosure out through the Global Reporting Initiative framework. That's still the focus that we have today. But as the landscape continues to evolve, we're going to continue to evaluate integrated reporting strategies, different mechanisms that are coming forward and targeting very specific categories of products and different sectors of business. So we'll continue to have to explore and understand what those look like. But today we report under the GRI.
Great. Well, then maybe to to close off a really interesting conversation, let me ask you both, like looking ahead, at the conference board, we always want to look ahead. So what do you think should be companies' like one or two top priorities in terms of sustainability, for going forward? Let me ask you first, Chuck. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would reflect that definition of sustainability as the CEOs were defining it, right? So, and as investors look at a company, how sustainable is it, if you will, for its future business model? It's the impact that's going to have. That there needs to be flexibility and agility to be able to address sustainability issues down the road. And the other notion is not to underestimate that impact on the reputational side a company has when it comes to addressing talent issues and having an advantage in a very tight sense of labor market. So, that transparency up front is going to pay a lot of dividends. Difficult to measure, sure, but it's going to pay dividends in the future, especially in the talent side. Mm-hmm. I really see that as one of the maybe undersold notions of sustainability within an organization.
Yeah, which is, that's a new angle on it, because you first think of, the external world, probably customers, shareholders. What are your thoughts, Lisa, on priorities for going forward?
Yeah, I really like Chuck's perspectives there. And I would add, the world is changing rapidly from a social and environmental perspective. Expectations of employees and consumers and key stakeholders are also changing rapidly. And understanding those emerging needs and expectations going forward is going to be key, particularly as it relates to those sustainability matters and issues that are relevant to your core business. I would say, secondly, driving very intentionally innovation that connects to both, that drives meaningful sustainability improvements on those key topics, but also inspires your consumer base, inspires your customers, inspires your employees, and the talent that you hope to attract to your company going forward. All going to be very important pieces of work that I think will help us to accelerate in the sustainability space.
Great. Well, we're at the top of the hour. Really interesting conversation. Thank you both, Lisa and Chuck, for joining this conversation. Thanks to our audience for joining us today. And thanks to our entire team here at the conference board for making this happen. Before we sign off, I just wanted to let you know about our next monthly chat by the Marketing and Communications Center. It will be on July 25th, again, the same time from 11 to 12 p.m. Eastern Time. It will be on, the title is A Case Study in Bad Buzz, and we look at how Solvay was attacked on social media. And we hope you can join us for that conversation. You will also receive the slides from today's meeting. You will see at the end we have included some of our upcoming events, both by the Marketing and Communications Center as well as by the ESG Center. And you'll also find upcoming research in that slide deck. So we hope you enjoyed today's conversation, and we look forward to seeing you in the future.
This has been Influencers from the Conference Board.